By mid-1944, Japan's naval air arm was operating inside limits it could no longer outrun. Aircraft still rolled off production lines and carriers were still capable of sailing, yet the trained pilots who made those platforms dangerous were disappearing faster than the system could replace them. That imbalance shaped every decision leading into the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Pressure had been building for months. American forces were advancing across the Central Pacific with growing speed, and each captured island extended air coverage while shrinking the space Japan once relied on for manoeuvre. The Marianas carried particular weight because their loss placed the Japanese home islands within range of long-range bombers, which meant the war would no longer stay distant or abstract. That reality left little room for delay. Japanese planners concluded that the American advance had to be stopped immediately, not slowed, not redirected, but broken outright, which meant committing the remaining carrier air groups to a decisive confrontation. On paper, the assembled force still looked formidable, with multiple carriers and hundreds of aircraft assigned to the operation. Beneath those numbers, however, the foundation had already cracked. Pilot quality had deteriorated sharply. Fuel shortages cut training hours, experienced instructors had been lost earlier in the war, and accelerated programs pushed barely prepared aviators straight into frontline units. The structure of naval aviation remained intact, but its depth had vanished. Only 2 years earlier, Japanese carrier aviation had been elite. Pilots accumulated extensive flight hours before combat. Squadrons trained together for long periods, and doctrine assumed high levels of coordination and discipline. The long attritional campaigns that followed Guadalcanal stripped that system piece by piece, and by 1944, the training pipeline no longer produced pilots capable of surviving modern carrier combat. Across the Pacific, the contrast could not have been sharper. American training programs expanded instead of contracting, flight hours increased rather than being rationed, and replacement pilots flowed steadily through a system designed to absorb losses without degrading overall effectiveness. The result was an air arm built for endurance rather than brilliance. The Philippine Sea brought those two systems into direct contact. Japanese planners understood that time worked against them. Prolonged air combat favoured American logistics and training depth, which meant Japan needed mass strikes capable of overwhelming defences quickly. That choice carried hidden risks because long-range attacks increased navigation errors, tightened fuel margins, and demanded precise coordination from pilots who no longer had the experience to deliver it consistently. Once aircraft were airborne, those risks became unavoidable. American carrier groups operated within layered defences built around radar, fighter direction, and coordinated patrols, and that system was designed to detect incoming raids early and intercept them far from the fleet. Japanese pilots flew toward estimated enemy positions, while American fighters were guided directly onto their approach paths. What changed the outcome was not bravery, but preparation. As Japanese strike groups launched, formations scattered, timing slipped, and some pilots failed to locate the American fleet at all. Others arrived in fragments rather than waves, which meant the intended shock effect never materialized. These failures did not stem from individual mistakes alone, but from a training system that could no longer support complex overwater operations under combat pressure. American radar detected the raids early, fighters were vectored efficiently, and interceptions began well before Japanese aircraft reached attack range. Pilots who survived those encounters then faced concentrated anti-aircraft fire and additional fighter screens closer to the carriers. Losses rose at a pace Japan could not absorb. American pilots operated with guidance, coordination, and numerical depth, which allowed them to choose the terms of engagement. Japanese pilots entered combat scattered, uncertain, and already short on fuel, which meant survival often depended on luck rather than skill. What made the battle decisive was not the number of aircraft lost in a single day, but what those losses represented. Each Japanese pilot destroyed at the Philippine Sea carried months or years of training that could not be replaced in 1944. Aircraft could be rebuilt and carriers repaired, but air power lives in people. That reality became impossible to ignore as the battle unfolded. Entire air groups disappeared, squadrons ceased to exist, and carriers returned with decks intact but air wings shattered. The platform survived, but the fighting power did not. A carrier without trained pilots is not a weapon, it is a hull. By committing their remaining air crews to the Philippine Sea, Japanese command had wagered the last functional layer of naval aviation. Once that wager failed, recovery was no longer possible. By 1944, air combat over the open ocean was no longer decided by eyesight or instinct. It was decided by systems that detected, tracked, and positioned fighters long before opposing pilots ever saw each other. At the Philippine Sea, that difference determined who entered the fight prepared and who entered already behind. American carrier groups operated inside a detection network that reached far beyond visual range. Radar picked up incoming aircraft early, bearings were refined continuously, and information flowed from operators to fighter directors without interruption. That structure gave commanders time, and time created options. Options are lethal in air warfare. Japanese forces had nothing comparable. Radar coverage was limited, inconsistent, and poorly integrated into decision-making. Strike groups launched toward estimated enemy positions rather than confirmed ones, which meant navigation errors accumulated before combat even began. Long-range missions amplified those errors, especially for pilots with limited experience flying over open water under pressure. This imbalance shaped every engagement that followed. American fighters did not search for the enemy, they were guided to it. Fighter directors vectored interceptors with precise headings and altitudes, placing them in favourable positions before contact occurred. Pilots arrived knowing where the enemy was likely to be and how the interception would unfold. Japanese pilots experienced the opposite. Many first learned of American fighters when tracers appeared in front of their canopies. Formations broke under sudden pressure, and once cohesion was lost, it rarely returned. Combat shifted from coordinated attack to individual survival within seconds. Training determined how each side handled that moment. American pilots entered the battle with extensive flight hours, repeated carrier landings, and experience operating within a coordinated system. Procedures were standardized, communication was disciplined, and pilots understood how to respond when plans changed mid-flight. Mistakes happened, but the structure around them limited the damage. Japanese training had been stripped down to its bare minimum. Fuel shortages reduced flight hours, accelerated programs replaced depth with speed, and new pilots arrived without the experience needed to manage complex engagements. Formation discipline suffered first, followed by situational awareness, and then by confidence. Once those elements collapsed, losses accelerated. Interception doctrine widened the gap further. American fighters attacked from positions of advantage, often from above, using speed and altitude to control the engagement. Attacks were short, deliberate, and focused on breaking formations before they reached attack range. Japanese pilots who pressed on burned fuel rapidly, leaving little margin for escape or return. Even those who slipped through the outer fighter screen faced additional layers closer to the carriers. Anti-aircraft fire was dense and coordinated, and combat air patrols overlapped to ensure that a single failure did not expose the fleet. No one mistake created disaster because redundancy absorbed it. Japanese doctrine depended on mass and momentum. When mass dissolved through interception and navigation error, parent momentum vanished with it. Courage remained, but courage could not replace coordination. The numbers reflected that reality, but they did not explain it. The lopsided loss ratios were not simply the result of better pilots shooting down worse ones. They came from one side entering combat inside a functioning system, while the other entered fragmented and blind. Every Japanese pilot lost carried weight far beyond the cockpit. In 1944, there were no reserves of experienced aviators waiting behind the lines. Each loss hollowed the force further, and each hollowed unit made the next engagement more dangerous. The cycle fed on itself. American losses, by contrast, were absorbed. Pilots were replaced, squadrons rotated, and training continued uninterrupted. The system bent, but it did not break. As the battle continued, but Japanese commanders faced an impossible calculation. Continuing attacks promised mounting losses with diminishing chances of success. Withdrawing preserved carriers but conceded control of the air. Either choice led to the same strategic result. That recognition settled in quickly. The Philippine Sea did not just defeat Japanese carrier aviation in the air, it exposed that the conditions required to fight a carrier air war no longer existed. Platforms remained, but the system that made them effective had collapsed. From that point forward, the sky over the open ocean belonged to the United States. When the fighting ended over the Philippine Sea, what stood out was not wreckage or burning carriers, but absence. Japanese ships returned with flight decks still intact and hulls largely undamaged, yet the air groups that had given those carriers meaning were gone. The silence that followed was not a pause between battles. It marked the end of Japan's ability to contest the air over open water. That outcome is often misunderstood because it lacks spectacle. Naval wars are usually remembered through sinking ships and dramatic losses, but air power does not disappear that way. It collapses quietly when pilots, training and organisation are consumed faster than they can be rebuilt. That is exactly what happened here. Carrier commanders grasped the implications almost immediately. Launching further large-scale air operations now meant risking the few experienced pilots who remained, and losing them would erase any chance of future recovery. Each sortie carried a cost that no longer produced strategic return. Carriers could still sail, but without capable air groups they could neither strike effectively nor defend themselves. This realization reshaped Japanese planning overnight. Offensive carrier operations ceased to be realistic options. Instead of acting as striking forces, carriers began to drift into secondary roles, used as decoys, transports, or symbols of strength rather than instruments of it. The change was not announced or debated publicly, but it showed up clearly in behaviour. Risk vanished because risk no longer offered reward. Rebuilding the air arm was not possible. Even if fuel had suddenly become plentiful, there were not enough instructors left to train new pilots to combat standard, and there was no time to restore unit cohesion. Accelerated programs could produce bodies, but they could not produce aviators capable of surviving radar-guided interception and layered defences. The problem fed on itself. Inexperienced pilots suffered higher losses, which reduced the pool of veterans even further, which in turn weakened training and command. Each attempt to recover made the situation worse. Strategic consequences followed quickly. Control of the air over the sea is the foundation of modern naval warfare, and once Japan lost that control, its ability to contest American advances collapsed across multiple fronts at the same time. The Marianas fell, and from there American bombers gained the reach to strike the Japanese home islands directly. The war moved from distant battlefields to Japan's doorstep. This shift also changed American decision-making. Carrier operations that once required caution could now proceed with confidence that opposition would be limited and increasingly disorganized. Losses would still occur, but they would not alter the balance of power. The difference between danger and existential threat had been settled. Japanese naval aviation moved into a defensive posture from which it never emerged. Land-based air power took on greater importance, and later tactics reflected acceptance that conventional air combat was no longer viable at sea. These were not creative adaptations. They were acknowledgements of collapse within a specific domain. The later turn towards suicide attacks cannot be separated from this moment. Those tactics emerged after trained pilots, fuel and coordination had already been stripped away. When systems fail, choices narrow and desperation fills the gap where doctrine once stood. It is tempting to treat this outcome as inevitable in hindsight, but it was not. Japan's early successes rested on elite training and careful preparation. The Philippine Sea revealed what happens when those foundations are eroded by sustained attrition and cannot be restored. That erosion also shaped later battles. Leyte Gulf is often remembered as the final destruction of Japan's navy, yet the surface ships that sailed into that battle did so without meaningful air cover. Their fate was sealed earlier when carrier aviation stopped functioning as a fighting system. The silence after the Philippine Sea made later defeats unavoidable. The most telling change was behavioural. Carriers avoided exposure, air operations shrank, and the tempo of Japanese naval warfare slowed permanently. No announcement marked the shift. It was visible in what did not happen anymore. Wars are not lost when forces lose the will to fight. They are lost when systems can no longer turn effort into effect. At the Philippine Sea, Japan's naval air system crossed that line. The Battle of the Philippine Sea differed from earlier defeats because it shut doors that Japan had relied on reopening before. Midway had been shocking but survivable. Guadalcanal had been draining but recoverable. What happened in June 1944 removed the final layer that made recovery possible at all. Timing played a decisive role. By mid-1944, Japan no longer had strategic margin. Fuel shortages were constant, industrial output was under strain, and the training system was already operating at its minimum viable level. When large numbers of carrier pilots were lost over the Philippine Sea, there was nothing left behind them to absorb the blow. Earlier disasters had occurred when Japan still possessed instructors, fuel, and time. Losses could be studied, methods adjusted, and cadres rebuilt. In 1944, none of those options existed. Instructors were already gone, fuel was rationed, and every month favoured the enemy. The Philippine Sea did not just inflict damage, it exposed how fragile the entire structure had become. Geography made the losses harsher. The battle unfolded far from friendly land bases, at extreme ranges over open ocean. Pilots who ditched rarely returned. Aircraft that turned back early often failed to make it home. Long-range missions drained fuel and endurance even before combat began, which meant attrition accumulated invisibly as well as violently. American commanders understood this and pushed interceptions outward. Japanese pilots were forced to fight at the edge of their range, with little margin for error, and even those who survived combat frequently ran out of fuel on the return. Losses mounted without dramatic explosions, which made them harder to grasp and impossible to reverse. Carrier warfare magnified the damage. Air power depends on cohesion. Squadrons train together, commanders rely on predictable performance, and pilots learn each other's habits through repetition. The Philippine Sea shattered that cohesion in a matter of days. Entire units disappeared, survivors were scattered, and what remained could no longer function as an integrated force. Even if replacement pilots had existed, there was no intact framework left to absorb them. Air power does not rebuild by simple addition. 10 pilots do not restore a squadron without shared training and trust. The battle destroyed those relationships, not just the aircraft. Doctrine collapsed along with cohesion. Japanese carrier tactics assumed a level of pilot proficiency and formation discipline that no longer existed. Simply Simplifying attacks reduced effectiveness while maintaining complexity increased losses. Every adjustment carried unacceptable risk, and no version of the doctrine fit the reality on hand. On the American side, the opposite occurred. With Japanese resistance weakening, American carrier groups refined coordination, extended operational reach, and increased sortie rates. The gap widened quickly, not because one side improved overnight, but because only one side still possessed a system capable of improvement. Psychology reinforced the material loss. Survivors understood that what had been destroyed could not be rebuilt. That awareness altered behavior immediately. Aggression faded, risk tolerance collapsed, and initiative disappeared. Future operations were shaped as much by shared understanding of limitation as by formal orders. This explains why Japanese carriers were later used as decoys rather than strike platforms. The decision was not irrational. It reflected acceptance that air groups could not survive direct confrontation. The carriers still had value as targets that could draw American forces, but they no longer had value as offensive weapons. The Philippine Sea also redefined air power's role within naval warfare. It demonstrated that without control of the sky, surface fleets could not maneuver, concentrate, or defend themselves effectively. That lesson would be confirmed at Leyte Gulf, where Japanese surface ships sailed without meaningful air cover and paid the price. From the American perspective, the battle validated long-term priorities. Training depth mattered more than early brilliance. Integration mattered more than individual heroics. Systems built for attrition outlasted systems built for perfection. The Philippine Sea was where those philosophies collided, and only one proved sustainable. What followed is as revealing as what occurred during the battle. There was no Japanese effort to rebuild carrier aviation to earlier standards. No renewed doctrine aimed at contesting American control of the air at sea. The absence of those efforts was not neglect. It was recognition that the path back no longer existed. The Philippine Sea did not turn the war. It locked its direction. The Battle of the Philippine Sea did not announce itself as an ending. No declaration followed, no sudden collapse, no single moment when Japan admitted that something fundamental had been lost. Instead, its meaning revealed itself through absence. After June 1944, Japan never again fought a carrier air battle on equal terms, and it never again attempted to seize control of the sky over open ocean. What vanished was not resolve, but possibility. Carrier aviation had been Japan's defining instrument of naval power. It demanded years of training, steady fuel supply, disciplined coordination, and experienced leadership. By the time of the Philippine Sea, that instrument was already worn thin. The battle did not blunt it further. It broke it outright. This is why the Philippine Sea must be separated from earlier defeats. Midway destroyed carriers but left the concept of carrier warfare intact. Japan could imagine rebuilding. Leyte Gulf shattered fleet coherence, but it came after air power had already collapsed. The Philippine Sea removed the one element that made naval recovery conceivable in the first place. After the battle, Japanese carriers still floated, still moved, still appeared formidable at a distance. What they lacked were air groups capable of turning movement into action. Without trained pilots, carriers could not strike effectively, could not scout reliably, and could not protect themselves. They became hollow platforms, present in form but absent in effect. That reality reshaped Japanese decision-making immediately. Carrier operations shifted from offensive planning to preservation. Risk was avoided not out of caution, but because risk no longer offered reward. Losing even a handful of remaining experienced pilots threatened to erase any residual capability altogether. American planners recognized this shift almost at once. Operations accelerated because resistance in the air at sea was no longer expected to recover. Amphibious assaults could proceed under reliable air cover. Logistics moved with fewer interruptions. The tempo of the war increased not because Japan stopped fighting, but because it could no longer impose systemic delay. This moment also exposed a deeper truth about modern warfare. Victory does not come from platforms alone. It comes from systems that can absorb loss and regenerate strength. Japan's early success rested on excellence without redundancy. Once that excellence was consumed, there was nothing underneath it. The United States built the opposite structure. Pilots were replaceable. Losses were planned for. Training pipelines expanded rather than contracted. Doctrine evolved continuously. The Philippine Sea was the point where those opposing approaches collided, and only one survived sustained pressure. After June 1944, Japan's naval war entered a different phase. Surface fleets operated without reliable air cover. Ground forces fought under constant threat from the sky. Supply lines deteriorated. Every campaign became more difficult, not because courage failed, but because the systems that translated effort into effect had collapsed. Later developments followed naturally from that collapse. Desperate tactics emerged because conventional options no longer existed. These were not evolutions of carrier aviation, but acknowledgements that it was gone. The nickname attached to the battle obscures its meaning. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot suggests ease and inevitability. What it actually revealed was exhaustion. One side still possessed a functioning system, the other did not. The imbalance felt overwhelming because it was structural, not situational. Japan did not lose the war in a single day over the Philippine Sea. What it lost there was the future shape of the war. From that point on, no strategic choice could restore parity in the air over the ocean. Resistance continued, battles followed, sacrifices multiplied, but direction was fixed. This is why the Philippine Sea deserves recognition as one of the most decisive battles of the Pacific War, not because it was dramatic, but because it was terminal. It did not shift momentum. It closed the last remaining path back. When the sky over the Pacific fell silent, the end was no longer uncertain. Only the timeline remained. For fact-driven breakdowns of the battles that didn't just change momentum but erased entire futures, subscribe to WW2 Battles.